You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on the Tomorrow Society podcast. I'm your host, Dan Heaton, and my guest today is a returning guest who was first here on episode 3 to talk about his book, Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow, Walt Disney and Technology, and that's Christian Moran, who has now directed and finished his documentary, which is Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow, the Futurism of Walt Disney, which to me was fascinating in the way that it looks at Walt Disney's use of technology in animated movies and in theme parks, and some of the firsts that he was able to accomplish that really helped to drive what we see today in so many different mediums. And the response to this film has been very positive, and you can actually watch it online for free. It's one of those movies that if you're a Disney fan, I cannot recommend highly enough, because there is a shortage of really great documentaries about Walt Disney. And another thing that I think is interesting about the conversation we had is that we really delved into the perception of Walt among the general populace and among fans, and what Christian kind of was hoping to do in terms of changing that a bit. So I think it was a really interesting discussion, and it starts in just a minute. Okay, well, I am joined today by my first returning guest on the podcast. He's an author. He recently finished the documentary Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow, the Futurism of Walt Disney, and it's available. You can watch it right now online. It's Christian Moran. Christian, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me again. I really appreciate it.
Well, great. Yeah, I remember on our first podcast, which was back in the late summer, early fall, we talked about your background with Disney, and we also talked about your book, Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow, which is a companion piece to the movie. So now that the movie is out, I wanted to dig more into your documentary. So I was curious right off the bat, when did you come up with the idea that you wanted to do a documentary on Walt Disney?
You know, it was definitely several years ago. I mean, the topic of Walt Disney as a futurist and the various technologies that he created and his kind of worldview had intrigued me for a long time, basically back since maybe 2004 when the Walt Disney Treasure sets had first been released. And they released a DVD called Tomorrowland that had, you know, various little documentaries on there, and also some of the old Tomorrowland episodes from the Disneyland series in the 50s, and then they had the EPCOT film on there, and that really got me interested in, you know, Walt as a futurist. But I think really a couple years ago, I just kind of said, no one else has done this, and you know, it might have actually been the Meryl Streep comments a few years ago when Saving Mr. Banks came out, when she kind of tried to reaffirm Walt as a anti-Semite and you know, a woman hater and a racist, and I kind of just said, well, maybe now it's time to try and show that not only those things were incorrect, but also you know, what a bright individual he was, and what he thought humanity could achieve.
Well, it's interesting that those comments then actually led to something positive, because it led to making the movie. It's interesting because I feel like there's been so many ebbs and flows with kind of the perspective on Walt Disney, where you have, like, even when Saving Mr. Banks came out, there was a lot of positive attention to Walt Disney. But then, like in that case, sort of not so positive. It's like every time he kind of moves more into the limelight, you have everybody, I mean, everyone comes out of the woodwork, you know, with various opinions. So
Exactly.
It's interesting that was one of the ways that it pushed you to do it, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if I had to put my finger on when I finally decided to move forward on it, it was probably right around that period. Yeah.
Interesting. So did you always want to make it as a feature documentary, or did it kind of evolve as it went along?
Oh yeah, it was always my intention to do it as a as a feature-length documentary. You know, the web series that I had made directly before that, called Everything Will Be All Right, that ended up as a 10-part web series, but originally I wanted it to be one feature-length film, and then I was like, well, I have so much material here, maybe I could do it as 3 films, and then it just became 10,
Hmm.
webisodes. But with this, that was always my intention. I had said, if I can keep it at moving at a brisk pace and cover as much ground as I can in about 145 minutes, I thought that people would stay engaged and, could go along with it.
Well, yeah, I mean, with Walt Disney's background, it's not about not having enough material to cover. It's almost more about, like you mentioned, kind of picking, okay, this is how long I want it to be, and now what are my key topics that I want to cover in order to, hit the points that I want to make, because there's so much material.
Oh yeah, so much material, absolutely. And that's why I was kind of surprised with all of the material out there that this topic had never really been looked at before, even in regards to a book. So I was happy to try and fill that gap. Hopefully we did a good job.
Oh, I thought it was great, and it was really interesting. And you mentioned, which I totally agree with, that there's still elements like this which have been, maybe will be hit on tangentially by another book or film, but aren't a primary focus. Why do you think that is? I mean, do you have an opinion on why? Is it just too much to cover, or why has that side not been represented before?
I mean, I think that there's just so much to Walt as a man and Walt Disney as a company that the animated films obviously are ripe for discussion, and the theme parks as well. I just think that most people probably aren't or weren't aware of the extent of Walt's involvement in the development of various technologies, or even the development of the theme parks themselves, or how hands-on he was with everything. When the progress of the Walt Disney Company from the early 20s, when it was, the Disney Brothers, up into 66 when he died, is really astounding when you look at everything that that company achieved, and it achieved it because of Walt's leadership and his vision for where they should go.
Right, right. And it's interesting too, on a related note, talking about, what's been covered, that we had around the same time, it came out a bit earlier, there was this 4-hour PBS documentary. I don't know if you were able to see that, but what I found interesting is, even though that had longer time than yours, and it did a good job, I thought it was an interesting movie, but I think that film struggled a bit because it didn't zone in as much. That's where I think you actually benefited with your film, in that you covered his whole life, but you were able to zone in a bit and not just try to do everything.
Yeah, after people started watching the film, I had some similar comments, where people were essentially saying that our documentary worked because it was so focused. And I think that perhaps, in the future, other documentaries, whether we make them or other companies do, I think that maybe a more focused narrative on Walt's life might be the best way to go. Because when you try to throw everything in there, you're going to kind of gloss over a lot of things that are very interesting, and that there is a lot of information, to go into.
Right. Yeah. And it's just like, because I keep waiting for someone to make, because, there's been so many documentaries about historical public figures that come out. And I keep waiting for someone to take a shot, either Disney or not, and make some sort of 3-hour theatrical documentary. But that's not, there's a reason it probably hasn't been done yet. I think, one, it could be that if you're doing it commercially, that Disney might not be so apt to do it, and two, it's a really daunting task.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It may one day be done. You know, you could make a 12-hour mini series on Walt in his entire life, and you probably still wouldn't cover everything. But there's ripe ground to be picked, and there's still a lot of interesting facets of Walt and the company that definitely should be covered that probably haven't.
Definitely. So I want to talk a little bit about the style you use for this, because I mean, see a lot of documentaries take more of the kind of what they call the talking head approach, where you have the experts there. They're speaking directly to an unseen interviewer who doesn't become kind of part of it. And what I liked about your movie, one of the things, and I know you've done a similar thing with your series you mentioned, Everything's Going to Be All Right. And you became kind of a little more active. I mean, you were still kind of the bystander, but you spoke, dressed the camera. When you interviewed them, you often were sitting next to them. And I'm curious, what made you decide to use this style? I did like it, and I was just wondering why that worked for you.
Oh, thank you. I guess, to be honest with you, it may have been kind of influenced by Walt Disney himself back in the Disneyland television episodes where, he was engaged with the camera. He kind of, introduced and exited every show, and he would sometimes narrate the whole thing. Sometimes they would bring narrators in. But I guess I felt like since this was my project and it was something that I had been wanting to make for a long time, I was the one with the passion for it. Why not, get up there and do it? It also helped that I had written the book, so a lot of my narration and a lot of when I, addressed the camera directly, I kind of just, either reworded or took from what I had written in the book. So it was kind of, by the time I got to that point of doing my on-camera segments, which was the very last, part of making this film, it was kind of just made sense.
Yeah, and I think they break up the segments really well too. So you mentioned you did that near the end. Was that something you decided to do during the editing, or was that something you always planned to do and you just waited to the end when you knew kind of how you were going to structure the film?
I think that I had a pretty good idea that that's what I was going to do, because especially once I started, whenever I get into a film project, I kind of outline everything and get the information exactly how I think it needs to be presented before I even do any of the interviews. And while I was doing my outlining, it kind of just made sense because I break the film up into, I think, 5 different categories or 5 sections. And so it kind of just made sense for me to kind of do intros and outros of the sections, an intro and an outro to the film, and to pop in every now and then when necessary.
Yeah, no, I think it's good because it seems like it's almost like we're taking this journey with you as you go through his life, rather than you kind of taking this off-scene narrator who's just saying this is what's important. It's almost like we're learning it along with you as you talk to Bob Gurr and Sam Genoway and everyone else.
Oh, cool. Good. I'm glad that it came off that way.
Well, I mean, at least to me,
Yeah.
I haven't done a poll, but I think it works.
Great.
So another thing that's really good compared to the book even is that it's great to see so much footage of of everyone in the group, but especially Bob Gurr and Rolly Crump, because I mean, obviously they've been involved with books and they've been on podcasts, but I've found that even with the few documentaries that are out there, they'll jump through so many Imagineers that you'll hear Rolly or Bob give their usual story. But what I thought was so good was that we were able to, because you had a smaller group of participants, we were able to spend more time with them. Like, how long did you talk to Bob and Rolly when you went out and met with them?
I think that, the entire interviews with both of them were probably about an hour and a half each. There's a lot of material that did not end up in the film, and I may just put them up on my website and on my YouTube channel at some point, just so that people can gain, what other information there is from those interviews, of which there was quite a bit. But obviously, when you're making the film itself is only an hour and 45 minutes,
Right.
So.
Well, it's that's impressive though, because I mean, if you've only talked to them for a good, because it's in order to get the amount of footage you did, to do that in a span of an hour and a half is pretty great. And speaking of from a fan's perspective, and I expect many would agree, any more clips of them talking about, whether it's attractions they worked on or stories from the early days of Disneyland would be, I'm sure people would check it out.
Oh yeah,
I will
absolutely.
say.
Especially with the Rolly Crump interview, We got into a lot about his early career when he was working in animation before he, went over to Imagineering. And I think that people would find some of that stuff interesting, that they're maybe not aware of his, that he began his tenure at Disney in animation and eventually moved over to Imagineering.
Yeah, Rolly's, backstory is fascinating. He's one of the both those guys are two of the most interesting guys that
Oh, yeah.
worked at him. And especially, too, because there aren't we're getting to a point where a lot of the people that work with Walt aren't alive anymore. And so that's where I almost feel like getting to not those guys both seem to be in good health, but getting to document people that work directly with him is really important because, another purpose I think your movie serves too is there's always a risk of Walt becoming just legend or this myth, and having these guys talk about like how he managed the company, I think is really important. So, from your perspective, you've learned all these things, but how can fans, what is the best way that, especially when some of these guys are gone, not to get to remember that Walt's a regular guy, I guess is the way I'm asking, because I think that's a challenge as a Disney fan. You at least think of him as that perfect guy on the hill or something.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think some of the best things they can do is to accumulate as much information as they can on Walt. Obviously there are a plethora of books out there, and one of the best series that I could recommend. Obviously, there's Jim Korkis's Vault of Walt, which gets into some interesting stories about Walt Disney. But Didier Gase's Walt's People series, which I believe is up to volume 17 now, basically compiles just hundreds, possibly at this point, it's approaching thousands probably, of interviews with various people that worked with Walt Disney, from the very beginnings in the 20s up to when he died in the 60s. And there's a lot of very personal accounts about Walt and working with him and what he was like that people can glean from those volumes.
Well, that's interesting. I have read Jim's books. Most of them. I know he has a lot, so I can't say I've
Yes.
read them all. And Jim, I even saw in the film, is like a treasure trove of
Oh,
historical
yeah,
knowledge.
absolutely.
Like he just led us through the middle, like the World War II era and everything. But I have not read those. I've heard of them, but those other series, which is fascinating. But now I'm a little daunted by these 17 volumes, though. So
Exactly. There's quite a bit, and of course, in my quest to accumulate as much knowledge as I can, when I was going into the film, I have 16 of those 17 volumes. So I can tell you, there's a lot of info in there, and they're basically just straight interview excerpts. There's no real narrative for the most part. It's just straight up people talking and the information that they kind of give out.
well, that's an interesting approach because it does kind of remove a lot of the subjectivity, which it's good to have someone who can kind of give you the context like Jim does, but it's also nice to have a bit of a different side of things for sure. So you were doing so much research, obviously, for the book and the movie. Were there things like what really surprised you? Because you probably went in with a lot of knowledge, but what kind of surprised you when you were doing all of your research?
I would say that the single most surprising thing that I learned during the course of this, and it actually wasn't from my own research, it was when I was interviewing Jim Korkis, and we kept it in the film, is the fact that the day that Walt Disney died, stock in the Disney company shot up, became more valuable. And that was because interested parties felt that Walt would no longer be around to kind of keep the company from making money. Because to Walt, yes, he felt that there was a responsibility to make for the company to make money and to get money for the shareholders. But really, Walt's main drive was not to make money so that he could stash it away and become ultra rich. And he, as Jim says in the film, he wasn't even financially solvent until the last year of his life. And had he lived on, he would have probably gone in debt again because of trying to finance EPCOT. But Walt really believed that the point of his company and the point of his making money was to redistribute that money back into the company, doing bigger and better projects. And with Walt out of the way, the powers that be, I guess, felt that they would be able to profit more now.
That's so interesting, and that it's funny because then, Roy came back out of retirement and they ended up spending a ton on Disney World. And so that legacy kind of hung on for a while. But I remember I've heard stories about Eisner coming in, and Eisner, led to some great attractions and helped build Disney parks where they are today, but would come in and find these shops that Walt, had set up that were just losing tons of money, but were there almost to be because they fit the period, and how that was like shocking to this commercial guy. So that kind of fits with.
Yeah.
Well, I remember you hear stories. It was like in the mid to late '80s where Eisner was kind of like, okay, we've got to do some things. But again, it's a different time period. But that's the benefit. It's the challenge because Walt easily, if something had failed, they could have gone under. But it's also the benefit in that he could accomplish things that a group like Bob Gurr talks about this and with management in the movie, where he says basically Walt just went and talked to people because he was the guy. Where even now at Disney, you've got the leader, but I don't think Bob Iger's doing the same thing.
No, I mean, Bob Iger, he's obviously doing a fine job managing the company, but yeah, I don't think he's walking around to the various departments checking in on everything like Walt was on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not sure hardly anyone would, but that shows you just how unique the situation was. And even in that time period, I doubt it was that common. But that's interesting, and I did find that really fascinating. That idea of this of like investors not because I'm sure people that work there thought, like I've read things that thought, well, how is this company even going to move along? And the stockholders were like, this is awesome.
Yeah.
So it's very funny. So you mentioned the EPCOT, and I know we talked about this on the last one about, what both of our beliefs are that, we think that if Walt had lived longer, that EPCOT, the city, would have worked and, in some form it would exist. So what I really like in the movie is how much you show of that film, because even though it seems common to certain Disney fans, it's not that widely seen as a completed product or as a lot of it. So, having seen that film, I'm just so curious for your perspective on if Epcot the city was built. I know we talked about this. What would you think modern Disney World would be like based on your? I mean, how different
wow.
would it be? I mean, it's a big question, but
It
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Sam Genoway and I have discussed this, and I think I agree with what Sam said in the sense that Disney World would probably be an even bigger deal than it already is and was had Epcot been finished for a number of reasons. Perhaps first and most importantly being that Walt's entire intention with Epcot was to show that we could fix the problem of our cities, that there was not a need for homelessness, for joblessness, that we could build cities that didn't need cars as transportations, that we could have clean, functional places that lived, that existed to benefit families, and that, his idea was basically to show this is what cities should be like in the future, and that we could augment cities as they were then. And I really believe that if it had worked, we may have had more kind of boutique towns or cities popping up trying to fix a lot of the problems that we've seen grow up since the 60s in terms of our urban environments. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing that would have been accomplished. In terms of what else would have happened at Walt Disney World, you would have had the industrial park where you would have had various companies building new technologies there, designing things. At that time, it would have been companies like Westinghouse and General Electric and, maybe IBM. Today, perhaps you would have labs, being run by Apple or Tesla or organizations like that. Walt's idea was not to build more and more theme parks. He had done the theme park with Disneyland. He knew that he had to build Magic Kingdom because that was, as they would have called it, the weenie, the thing that would have attracted everybody to go there. But he wanted to build Disney World because he wanted to build a city. First and foremost, that was the entire purpose of Disney World. And I don't think had Walt lived, say, into the 70s or the 80s, obviously Epcot Center wouldn't have been built. I highly doubt that the Disney Studio and Animal Kingdom would have ever come to fruition. And I really think it would be an entirely different place. But most importantly, had he lived to see Epcot through, who knows what he would have moved on to after that. Lillian Disney, his wife, was 4 years older than he, and she didn't pass away until the late 90s. So if you could imagine Walt living through the 80s and 90s, experiencing the internet, and what he possibly could have done with those technologies, it really is fascinating to think what he possibly would have done.
Yeah, and I had Sam on the podcast a little last fall, and I had a similar question. That's kind of what jogged my memory about it, is because we were talking more about his book on Universal, but we did discuss the Epcot, the city, a bit, and it's just a fascinating. And I agree with you. I love the Animal Kingdom and the studios. It's in flux right now, but I've enjoyed going there. But a lot of that came from Eisner, who especially was a movie guy, and then obviously the Animal Kingdom came after as they expanded the resort. But I agree with you. I think, and Sam mentioned this too, he thinks the impact on the idea of a city was probably even bigger than the impact on Walt Disney World. And I mean, it's mind-boggling, the alternate universe, where it would happen. But you can see it. Walt, I mean, when he recorded that film, he was very close to his passing.
Yep.
And you see it, but you still see that look in his eyes, like he's as excited about that as he was in the videos when he was about the Disneyland videos in 1955 or something. He's got that same look, like, he's not doing this just to market, as a marketing piece. This is what excited him. And it's too bad I love Epcot Center, especially the way it was, but I'm really curious what we would have gotten.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that it's unfortunate not just for us as Disney fans, but I think that it's an unfortunate loss really for the human race, because Walt was creating industry after industry, whether it be the feature-length animated film industry or the theme park industry. He created surround sound. He was the big person pushing for robotics. And I mean, he had a robotics lab in the early 1960s. He had such a profound effect on our lives that we really don't, that we really take for granted. Had he been able to build this city, in this alternate universe, you and I would probably take boutique cities or whatever would have come about from it, for granted as well.
Yeah, I would not mind living in that world, I
Yeah.
would think, but hey, I'm glad that, he was able to accomplish so much. So I don't mean to turn this into kind of a morbid
Oh, yeah.
look, but getting back to the film a little bit, because we could go down that zone for about 3 hours, I think.
Exactly.
But even with just focusing more on, I mean, not just, but his futurism and technology, I'm sure there were some things you wanted to talk about that you just couldn't fit in. Was there one topic that was really the toughest not to cover in the film?
Oh, absolutely. There was one particular sequence that is in the book, but that I had to cut from the film just because narratively it kind of slowed the flow down. But the sequence we were going to talk about essentially the Magic Highway USA episode which was a Tomorrowland episode in the Disneyland series. And if you're not familiar with it, essentially, as the Disneyland series did, Walt kind of discusses the history of transportation at the beginning, and goes into transportation in the United States and how it started kind of with horse and buggy, and then you had the advent of the steam engine and everything, and then the development of the automobile and how the automobile revolutionized travel in the United States. And they go into the creation at that time of the highway system that was still being developed. And towards the end, they look at the future of automobile transportation, and they discuss a number of things that we're just now beginning to have today in our automobiles. They discuss GPS navigation systems. They discuss rear view cameras. They even discuss autonomous cars, which we're just now starting to get with the Google driverless cars and things of that nature. So, I had this idea to just do kind of a split screen segment where on the left side of the screen, we were going to show the Magic Highway film, And on the right side, we would have shown these things today, you know, the GPS system, the rear view mirror, or the rear view camera, and you know, the driverless cars and things like that. I think it would have been definitely would have been interesting to put in there, but I had to cut it because of the narrative flow, unfortunately.
Right, because you start to hit a point where you're going through Disneyland and the World's Fair and everything, and it's like, where do you kind of slot that in at that point
Exactly.
without slowing things down? But that's fascinating too, just the idea that things they were putting in that show are still coming to fruition. It makes me think of the
Exactly.
the space ones they did, where they were talking about, oh, now we're going to go to Mars and everything,
Yeah.
and we're still kind of sitting here going, well, now we're kind of having tests. I mean, we're testing, how long we can be in space and all
Oh
that to
yeah.
do that.
But
So,
that, you
so
know,
it's
I
interesting.
was just going to say
Yeah.
that's an entire other discussion, you know, of what should have happened with our space program as well.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
actually another idea for a documentary that I am considering doing about where NASA kind of went off the rails after Apollo, and what the idea was. You know, they thought we could have gone to Mars in the 70s. That's what von Braun wanted to do, but they you know, started slashing the budget, and we've just been kind of doing circles around the Earth for the last 40 years, unfortunately.
Well, if you do that documentary, I do have some opinions on the topic, but and I think we might be in a similar boat because I
Exactly.
have read about von Braun and his, and even in that show, but his plans, and then what happened with Vietnam and a lot of things that
Exactly.
unfortunately didn't help out. But that's a fascinating topic on its own. But again, it's another, to circle it back to Walt. It's another thing where, not that he would have done it, but that he had his, him and the people he worked with definitely were looking ahead more than just creating amazing theme parks.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned about how you had to do so much research for the book and the kind of the background. In terms of, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about that much is just the wealth of footage that you're able to incorporate and edit very well with the interviews and with, your comments, especially some of the early animation, some of that footage, which I know a lot of that is probably public domain and fairly easy to find. But what was kind of one of the best resources for you in terms of gathering footage to use?
The Walt Disney Company. Yeah. You know, over the years, I've been able to accumulate, you know, a wealth of DVDs and Blu-rays that they've released. You know, I'm a fan of obviously of Walt Disney the person, and of Disney the entertainment company. So I've gladly purchased a number of their home video releases. But I'd probably have to say that, again, the Walt Disney Treasure DVD sets are really invaluable to a true fan of Disney history. I think I have all of them at this point, except for the Doctor Sin release, which was a Disneyland television kind of miniseries. But they run, you know, they go from the very beginnings of the company, from Walt's Alice shorts, and even before that, some of the Laugh-O-Gram stuff he did when he was still living in Kansas City, to various Disneyland television episodes. You know, I would definitely have to say that that was where. Oh, and the you know, victory through air power and the various World War II shorts and propaganda films. There is really a wealth of information within the Walt Disney Treasure DVDs, and most of them today are very, very expensive. But if you can get your hands on them, I highly suggest it.
Yeah, and I'm really kicking myself. I own like the Disneyland one, but I'm really kicking myself that I did not purchase a lot of them when they were not $300 or whatnot. I
Exactly.
mean, some of the lesser exciting ones you can find fairly reasonably, but the big ones like Tomorrowland, and luckily my local library has the one with Victory Through Air
Oh,
Power
that's
and all
great.
the war shorts, which are
Yeah.
fascinating. And I know you referenced that in your movie, but those are, if I'll second your comment that especially the ones relating to some of the lesser, the footage is not, you're not seeing all the time everywhere, or the ones about Disneyland or about Tomorrowland. Those are great resources
Oh,
for sure.
absolutely.
So now that you've released this documentary, I know we talked about it the last time when I asked you a similar question. Do you have another film project that's on the horizon? I know you mentioned possibly the Apollo one, but is there anything you're really actively working on?
Oh, well, yeah, there's actually a number of projects kind of lined up and in various stages of development. The one that will probably most definitely go forward some point soon is essentially a sequel to my first documentary, Ayahuasca Diary, which dealt with ayahuasca as a substance that the indigenous people of the Amazon rainforest have made for thousands of years. It's a tea derived from a vine called ayahuasca, and they claim it can cure any disease on the planet, whether it be physiological or psychological. So in my original film, I took a few people down there, a man with cancer, woman with rheumatoid arthritis. I myself have suffered from psoriasis, and essentially just tracked them being treated by a shaman in the Amazon for several weeks. And if you ever check out the film, you'll see the results. My family right now, I'm actually heading my family's charitable foundation along with my various artistic endeavors. And we're actually working with some of the indigenous people down there to build an ayahuasca research center, which is supposed to be complete at the middle of this year. And when that's finished, either later this year or early next year, I will most likely be going down there to take, hopefully, I would like somewhere around 10 people with a variety of different illnesses and stay there for maybe about 6 weeks and film that and hopefully be able to show to an even better degree the benefits of this substance. Outside of that, I'm also possibly working on, I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio, and I went to Ohio State for a year before I moved to California and went to film school. The rest of my family graduated from Ohio State, so we're big fans of their football program. And I might be doing a documentary on the week leading up to the Ohio State-Michigan football game and what that kind of means to the people of Columbus and the university in general. And outside of that, the Apollo one I discussed. The one I'm kind of most interested in is a film I'm working on called Dream of Peace, which deals with, looks at John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, and looks at them from 1960 to 1969 and the ways in which they promoted peace and unity between not just Americans but all of the planet, and the ways that they went about doing this, the misconceptions about some of these men, and ultimately the fact that these four men who were promoting peace were murdered.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a really interesting topic on its. I mean, especially connecting the four together because that time period is so much happened at that time. Yeah,
Exactly.
and then yeah, the fact that obviously none of them unfortunately made it out of the
Yeah,
decade is
because it was pretty much like a transitory period. Like you said, a lot happened. When you look at
Mhm.
Walt in the 50s and the 60s, there was really this idea that things were going to get better, that there was progress ahead, and not just America, but the world, humanity in general, that whatever we could dream of, we could do, and we were going to do great things. And really, with the start of the Vietnam War, the escalation of it under Johnson and even more so under Nixon, there was a distinct change in, kind of like the overall beliefs of the American people at that time. I think that we went from being a positive society to a very kind of cynical society, and that's pretty much stayed that way all the way up through today, I would say.
Well, I'll be interested to see that, and we talked a bit about your ayahuasca diary film and what you were doing going forward. And I know you mentioned that with that film that the first experience, while you liked it was very fascinating, was kind of a challenging shoot. Do you think you've learned some things now, or you think doing a sequel will be not an easier road maybe, but you've learned some approaches that'll work better?
Well, I think that I'm definitely a more experienced filmmaker by now. At that time, I was, geez, what was I? 22.
Wow.
Just out of film school. And I kind of was just like, this is an interesting topic and it's important, and I'm going to go down and shoot this movie in the Amazon. And it would, like, as you and I discussed, it was a very, very, very trying shoot. And most of the relationships with people I had at that period that worked on that were kind of severed after that. At this point, as I said, I'm a more experienced filmmaker, and at the same time, I think that I have a crew of people that I've been working with for years now that are jumping at the bit to get down there and kind of know what to expect once we get down there. At the same time, hopefully, I think that things will be filming at this retreat that we've been building. Things will be a little bit more comfortable for people and kind of more self-contained, as opposed to doing a 7-mile trek through the jungle, which was an incredible experience, but it was definitely the hardest physical experience I've ever been through, and I know that it was for that crew as well.
Well, it sounds really interesting. I'll definitely keep an eye out for that, and some of the other work you're talking about. So beyond all those films, are you looking to do anything like maybe another documentary about Disney?
Yes, I am. I was trying to rack my brain, because Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow has really been a passion of mine to make for a long time. That was the one statement that I really wanted to make about Walt. And as I thought about what other things might be interesting to do, I've had this idea of what I call travels with Walt. And essentially what we would do, and possibly traveling with Jim Korkis or somebody knowledgeable, we would travel to various places that Walt lived, or places that he went in his life, that he kind of learned valuable lessons from, that he then, and we would kind of show how those relate to things that he did in his life. So we would go to the Walt Disney Birthplace Museum in Chicago and the Walt Disney Hometown Museum in Marceline, and take a look at where the Laugh-O-Gram studio was in St. Louis. And then we'd get on a train like he did and travel from St. Louis to Los Angeles. And then when we get to LA, we'd look at the various houses that he lived in and places where Disney Studio was located, even before the Hyperion Studio lot, when it was the Disney Brothers. Go to some of the various restaurants and places that he liked to go, and maybe we would have some various Disney legends pop in and out every now and then to give some more perspective on what we're seeing. I think that might be something interesting to do.
Well, yeah, and Jim, like we talked about earlier, has so much backstory about Walt's life. And now that, like you mentioned, like the museum, the Chicago Museum, and what could happen in Kansas City, it seems like, and even in Marceline, they're building things up. It's a really good time to do something like this.
Yeah, I think you're right. So, apart from all those other things we just talked about, who knows? This might be the one that gets moved on first. And if not first, it's definitely in the pipeline, I think.
Well, great. I'm looking forward to seeing that too. So if my listeners want to watch Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow or learn about your work you've done and what's coming up ahead, what's the best place to go?
Well, you can go to my website, www.christianmoran.com. You can visit the CM Films Facebook page, which is just facebook.com/CMFilms. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram. I believe on Instagram I'm Christian.m.Moran, and on Twitter I'm just Kristian M. Moran. And if that's not the case, it's the opposite. So try both of those, and you'll eventually find me.
Well, excellent. Well, Kristian, it's been great having you back on the podcast, and the film's fascinating, and thanks so much for being on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad that you enjoyed the film, and for everyone listening, if you check out the film, I really hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Well, it was really cool to have Kristian back on the show, and I really liked his documentary, so it was a real treat to talk with him. And if you'd like to learn more about what I'm doing, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com, or if you want to contact me, you can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. And I have one request for you. If you could go to iTunes and give a rating for this podcast, it only takes a few seconds, and it would really help the show, especially if you like it, to reach more listeners. That is all I ask of you. my wonderful listeners in order to help grow the podcast and continue to get the word out to Disney fans. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.